A little girl with cancer had one final wish: to meet a royal guard. 15 years. That's how long James Harrison had served, in absolute stillness, in rain and frost, in war zones and royal ceremonies. He had faced down hecklers, braved 2 tours in Afghanistan, and stood his post with the poise of a statue. But that morning he moved, and what followed, it left grown men weeping in silence. Before we begin, drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Subscribe if you believe that duty can be more than just discipline, because tomorrow we bring you another true story from the Royal Guards that will move your heart. Now let me take you back to that morning when everything changed. The sun hung low over Buckingham Palace, brushing its light across the perfectly polished brass buttons of James Harrison's scarlet tunic. Tourists bustled past, unaware of how deeply this morning would etch itself into memory. James stood motionless, not just by training, but by habit, by discipline, by pride. 15 years of never wavering, never reacting. He had trained his body to resist flinching at screams, to ignore mocking gestures, and to forget the ache of standing for hours. But even in silence, he observed everything. And that's when he saw her. A small family cut gently through the crowd. A father, a mother, and between them, a fragile girl, no more than 7. She wore a pink dress too elegant for an ordinary day, and a colorful beanie stretched snugly over her bald head. Her skin was pale, drawn, but her eyes, they danced with a light that no illness could dim. "Mommy, look, he's so tall and his uniform is so red," she called out with surprising brightness. Tourists turned. Some smiled, some quickly looked away. One woman bent down to explain to a child in hushed tones, "Sometimes people get very sick. That's why we should be extra kind." James heard it all, not because he was eavesdropping, but because every soldier learns to listen for what matters. "Stage 4, someone murmured behind him. She just wanted to see the Royal Guard. James had heard that tone before, in hospital corridors, in field medics' tents, in whispered prayers. The parents exchanged a look over their daughter's head. It was the look of people holding on to every second, not with despair, but with fragile hope. The kind of hope that tightens your chest and makes you pray to anything that might listen. "Not too close now, Emily," her father said, gently pulling her back. "Remember what we talked about?" Emily nodded. "I know. They protect the Queen and the palace, and hundreds of years of tradition." She pronounced the words carefully, like a student reciting sacred text, and in many ways she was right. To understand why this story matters, you have to understand what it means to be a royal guard. These men and women are trained not only in ceremony, but in combat. Their discipline isn't theatrical. It's real. It's historical. Every movement they make or refuse to make is a symbol of order, of honor, of Britain itself. And James Harrison was among the best of them. 2 tours overseas, Medal of Gallantry, a man who never bent, never broke. But Emily didn't know any of that. She just knew she loved the Guards. She had read every book, watched every documentary, drawn them in her sketchbooks while lying in a hospital bed, fighting through rounds of chemotherapy that would make a grown man cry. She's been talking about this for weeks. Her mother whispered to a kind stranger nearby. James noticed the way tourists began giving the family space. Even the Americans, usually bold with cameras, had stopped clicking. Something unspoken spread through the courtyard: respect. And there stood James, expression unchanged, but something in his chest shifted. He had faced danger, faced war, but never had he faced a child's gaze like this, so full of admiration, so unaware of how sick she looked or how much she'd already endured. He wanted to blink, but he didn't. He wanted to speak, but he couldn't, not yet, because this was Buckingham Palace, because he was the guard, because there were rules. But what happens when the line between duty and compassion begins to blur? Let's keep going.
As Emily inched closer, every step seemed to stretch time itself. Her parents flanked her protectively, but it was clear they were following her lead now. This was her moment. And though she was small and visibly tired, her eyes locked onto Guard Harrison's with the kind of reverence most children reserve for superheroes. "Look at his medals, Daddy," she whispered in awe, her breath catching. "Do you think he got them for being brave?" James didn't flinch, but inside, something tugged. That question, simple, sincere, came from a place no adult could ever fake. A child asking not just about medals, but about courage. a child who knew what bravery looked like. Her father replied gently, steadying his voice. I'm sure he did, sweetheart, just like you're brave every day at the hospital. Emily nodded, proudly touching the tiny pin on her dress. A small token from her nurses, perhaps a sticker yesterday. Now a makeshift medal, but she wore it with the same dignity James wore his. Around them the world softened. No shuffling feet, no idle chatter. The crowd had turned reverent. Even the guards at nearby posts noticed. Some may not have turned their heads, protocol forbade it, but their awareness shifted. This wasn't a tourist. This was something else, something sacred. James could feel it in his posture. A tension building beneath his stoic frame, like the pulse in his fingertips had quickened. He knew the rules, knew them by heart. You don't move, you don't speak, you stand. But rules exist within a context. And sometimes the world changes context without warning. That's what war teaches you. That's what life teaches you. As Emily stood just a few steps away now, she asked, in the most formal, polite voice she could muster, "May I please take a picture with him? I promise I won't break any rules." Her mother glanced at her watch, anxiety flickering across her face, but she smiled anyway. "Of course, sweetheart, just a quick one, okay?" Emily smoothed out her pink dress with trembling hands, the kind of motion that might look ordinary, but to any nurse or soldier watching, it revealed the truth. The strain, the fatigue, and yet the will. She adjusted her beanie, standing as tall as she could. "Just like a real guard," she whispered. From his post, James caught her reflection in the glass panels behind the palace gates. And what he saw was not a sick child. He saw a comrade, a warrior standing at attention, trying just for this one moment to be part of something larger than herself. And suddenly, James wasn't thinking about his orders. He was remembering something from years ago, a boy bleeding in the dirt of Kandahar. A medic kneeling down, protocol forgotten, choosing humanity over instruction. There was a weight in James's chest now. Not sadness, not pity, duty, but not the kind written in handbooks or whispered in royal briefings. The kind of duty that comes when you recognize true courage and must respond. Emily stood firm, her knees trembling slightly. "Do I look soldier straight, Daddy?" she asked. And James Harrison, guard, veteran, sentinel of tradition, made a decision. For 15 years, he had been unmovable, a statue in crimson. But today, his strength would come from motion. Because sometimes, the greatest honor isn't in never breaking the rules. It's in knowing when to.
A ripple passed through the courtyard the instant James Harrison moved. It wasn't dramatic, no grand gesture, no fanfare. But to those watching, it felt like watching a cathedral breathe. His boots pivoted with precision. Shoulders squared, eyes still steady. He turned to face the little girl who had, without even trying, shattered the invisible wall between soldier and citizen. A gasp swept through the crowd. Some raised phones in disbelief. Others lowered theirs, unwilling to intrude. Emily froze, her wide eyes filled with wonder. "He moved," she whispered. "Mommy, he moved." And then, the moment that no one saw coming, Guard Harrison lowered himself, one knee to the ground, posture perfect, gaze level, and suddenly they were equals, a soldier and a child, a battle-hardened veteran and a 7-year-old fighting her own war. "Hello, Emily," he said, voice calm and steady. "I couldn't help but notice how perfectly you've been standing at attention." It was the first time many had ever heard a Queen's Guard speak. Emily's hands flew to her mouth. You can talk," she gasped, then quickly added, "Sir." That one word, "sir," carried more dignity than some entire parades. James gave a small nod. Then slowly he reached into the row of decorations on his chest, unpinned one, held it out with care. "This," he said, "is awarded for exceptional bravery under difficult conditions." The crowd held their breath. James continued, "I believe you know quite a bit about that." Emily's mother let out a sob, one hand covering her mouth. Her father's phone, still recording, trembled slightly in his grasp. No one moved. No one blinked. Even the tourists at the far end of the square stood still, as if Buckingham itself was holding its breath. "May I?" James asked, waiting for Emily's nod. With practiced grace, he leaned forward and pinned the medal to her dress, just above the small hospital pin she had so proudly worn. "There," he said, "you're officially part of the Guard." It was a line that would echo in the hearts of every person who heard it. Emily's fingers touched the medal as if unsure it was real. Her face, lit by both sun and awe, beamed with joy so powerful it pulled at the soul. "But don't you need it?" she asked, concern flickering through her happiness. James smiled, the kind of smile born from battles fought, regrets buried, and pride earned. "I think you've earned it more than I have." From the edge of the crowd, a murmur of emotion passed, a chorus of sniffles, soft claps, handkerchiefs raised to tearful cheeks. It's worth pausing here to understand what this moment meant. The Queen's guards are symbols of the crown, of empire, of order. But in that instant, James Harrison reminded everyone that true honor doesn't come from medals or silence, but from knowing when to recognize greatness in others, especially when it wears pink and walks with shaky legs. Emily stood straighter, not because she had to, but because now she belonged. And James, he wasn't done yet. "Would you like to learn the official salute?" he asked gently. Emily lit up. "Yes, sir." The next few minutes were quiet magic. James guided her small hand through the proper motion. She concentrated, tongue poking slightly out of the corner of her mouth, eyes focused. When she finally got it just right, a round of applause erupted from the crowd. It wasn't planned. It wasn't performative. It was pure respect, given not just to Emily, but to the man who saw her strength and honored it the only way a soldier can.
The applause hadn't fully faded when something even more unexpected happened. James Harrison opened his arms. It was subtle, no grand gesture, just a quiet offering, the kind a soldier gives not to a superior, but to an equal in courage. "Would you do me the honor?" he asked. Emily didn't hesitate. She stepped forward, her tiny arms stretching as far as they could to wrap around his broad red tunic. Her chin rested gently against the gleaming brass buttons she'd admired just moments earlier. Her cheek pressed softly against a uniform built to stand for monarchy and nation, now bent in service to something far more eternal: compassion. Around them, the crowd exhaled. Some wiped their eyes. Others simply watched in silence, knowing instinctively they were witnessing something sacred. In that embrace, the weight of her illness, of months spent in hospitals, of whispered diagnoses and quiet hallway prayers, seemed for a moment to lift. And the weight James had carried, the memories of war, the years of stillness, the unspoken weariness of a soldier who has seen too much, softened. They weren't guard and girl anymore. They were two warriors, meeting in the middle. When they finally parted, Emily's face was glowing, brighter than the medal now pinned proudly on her chest. And then, just as quietly, James stood. But this time was different. He didn't rise back into ceremony. He rose like a father would, gently, purposefully, as if not to disturb the peace they had just created. He straightened, snapped a formal salute, not a photo-op salute, not the stiff wave tourists sometimes coax out of performers. This was the real thing, the kind of salute reserved for generals, for heroes, and that morning it was for Emily. Her mother whispered through tears, "You have no idea what this means. Thank you." Her father added, This is more than we ever." James gave a small nod, no words, just the kind of look soldiers pass between them, the look that says, "I understand, I see you, I carry this with you." He turned to Emily, who was beginning to show signs of fatigue, but her posture remained strong, her hand hovered near her brow. "Remember," James said, his voice low, steady, deeply proud. "You're one of us now, stand tall." "Yes, sir," she replied, then, with every ounce of strength her tiny frame could gather, she gave one final perfect salute. It was a moment of cinematic symmetry, except no screenwriter could have written something so true. James returned to his post, boots together, rifle lifted, eyes forward, but something had changed. It wasn't in his uniform or his stance. It was in the air around him. Those watching sensed it. The man who now stood was more than a guard. He was a keeper of stories, guardian of spirit. And in that moment, he stood not for tradition, but for love. Now let's pause here and reflect. What makes a soldier break protocol? What causes a man forged in discipline to kneel before a child? The answer is simple and timeless: recognition. James Harrison recognized something in Emily, something he had seen in battlefields and recovery wards, in young comrades who never made it home, and in quiet glances between medics and the wounded. He saw the fight in her eyes, and for a man trained to defend the crown, perhaps the greatest act of loyalty he could give was to bow to a braver heart than his own. That's what makes the Royal Guards special. Not just their stillness, not just their uniforms, but their discernment. They don't react to everything, only to what truly deserves it. And when they do respond, the world takes notice.
Word of what happened that morning spread fast, not because James Harrison intended it, not because it was shared by the palace or filmed for glory, but because every single person in that courtyard, from the businessman who wiped his eyes to the child who waved shyly at Emily, felt something change. They had come to see guards, but they left having witnessed grace in uniform. As Emily and her parents walked slowly back through the parted crowd, her medal catching the light. Many reached out to offer quiet words or simply brush a hand gently over her shoulder. Strangers, tourists, locals, people from opposite ends of the world, all connected in a shared reverence for something deeply human. It was more than admiration for Emily. It was respect for what had just unfolded, the unspoken understanding that protocol had bent, not for celebrity, not for spectacle, but for something sacred. And here's the truth. Very few institutions on Earth carry the kind of symbolic weight the Royal Guards do. They are pillars of continuity. They don't blink when mocked, don't shift when photographed, don't break formation for any reason, unless it's a matter of true security or life. And yet, that morning, one guard had done something more radical than shouting or intervening. He had chosen compassion, wrapped in discipline. This is what people often miss about these men and women. Their strength doesn't lie in simply following tradition, it lies in embodying it. And sometimes tradition isn't about rigidity. Sometimes it's about knowing why it exists. James Harrison understood this. This wasn't just a moment of sentiment, it was a moment of leadership. He reminded us all that strength without wisdom is dangerous. But strength, when tempered by mercy, that's where legacy lives. Many who watched that day later shared how the moment shifted their perception. One man wrote, "I'd always thought of the guards as statues in funny hats. Now I'll never see them the same way again." Another, a nurse who had treated children like Emily, said, "That guard didn't just make a child smile. He gave her something to carry for the rest of her days, however many are left. He gave her dignity." Perhaps the most striking comment came from a fellow veteran. He wrote, "We're taught to follow orders, but the best soldiers I knew were the ones who knew when to break them." That comment speaks volumes because James didn't abandon duty. He fulfilled it on a deeper, more sacred level. He reminded us that duty isn't just about posture, it's about presence. And here's the subtle beauty of the Royal Guards. They're not trained just to be unshakable. They're trained to be aware. They must sense tension in a crowd, listen without reacting, interpret threats, feel atmosphere, track movement, all while standing perfectly still. It's an art. And James used that very art to notice Emily. Not because she demanded attention, but because something about her, the way she moved, the way her parents hovered, the way her spirit shimmered through her illness, called to the core of his being as a protector. It wasn't random. It wasn't luck. It was years of honed instinct, responding in the only way that made sense, by offering his silence, and then, when it mattered most, breaking it.
That afternoon, long after the crowd had cleared and the usual rhythm of the palace had returned, James Harrison stood quietly in the guards' quarters, still in uniform. No one said a word. His fellow guards, many of whom had seen, or at least heard, what had happened, offered nods of quiet respect. Not one rebuke, not one question about protocol. Because here's the unspoken truth among soldiers. Real courage recognizes real courage. And what James had done that morning wasn't a violation. It was a tribute. Later, as he quietly polished the metal slots on his tunic, now missing one, he paused. That missing space wasn't a loss. It was a story. And not just any story, her story. Emily's. A story of a little girl who stood straighter than her body allowed, who smiled through a battlefield no soldier would envy, who had spent her life fighting not for glory or medals, but for another morning, another memory, another moment of feeling normal. And maybe, just maybe, that day at Buckingham Palace was the first time she did feel normal, not because she was invisible, but because she was honored. James never spoke publicly about what happened, not because he was ashamed, but because humility is its own uniform. Yet inside the ranks, his action rippled like quiet thunder. Veterans who had served with him spoke of his calm under fire, his steadiness, his near-superhuman focus. But they also said he had something deeper, a kind of discernment that couldn't be trained. One former comrade put it this way: James always knew when it was time to stand still and when it was time to kneel. And that speaks to something often overlooked in discussions about discipline. Discipline isn't just about doing what you're told. It's about knowing why you're doing it and having the moral clarity to act when the moment calls for something more. Think about that. It would have been easier, safer for James to do nothing, to hold the line, to stay still, and no one would have blamed him. But what he chose was harder. He chose vulnerability. He chose visibility. He chose to let the world see that beneath the armor of uniform and expectation, there still lived a man guided by conscience. And in doing so, he elevated the very tradition he represented. Because tradition is not brittle. tradition, when upheld by people of integrity, is flexible enough to grow. That's why people from across the world wrote letters, why children mailed in hand-drawn cards with crayon salutes, why military officers, some retired, some active, reached out to commend the gesture. It wasn't just a sweet moment, it was a lesson, a reminder that strength is not the absence of emotion, that power is not found in posture alone. It's found in the willingness to lower oneself for someone smaller, someone weaker, someone brave. The royal guards are often seen as symbols of stoic control. But inside that stillness lies an extraordinary discipline of awareness, precision, and, when needed, compassion. And James Harrison had shown all three. In that one kneel, he didn't just honor a sick child. He restored something ancient in all of us, the belief that tradition and humanity are not rivals, but partners.
Weeks later, the photograph emerged. Not a staged image, not filtered or polished. Just a simple moment, frozen in time. Emily, smiling up at James Harrison, her tiny body leaning ever so slightly forward, the medal on her dress catching sunlight like it belonged there all along. It spread quickly, across social media, across oceans, across language barriers. People from every continent, soldiers, nurses, parents, children, wrote messages not just about how moving the moment was, but about how necessary it felt. Because we live in a world so often hardened by routine, fear, and division. And yet here was proof that tenderness could still rise, even from stone. Buckingham Palace declined to comment directly, but inside the Guard, something unspoken shifted. No changes in policy, no memos, just a deeper respect for the humanity behind the uniforms. You see, the Royal Guard is more than ceremony. It's a living system of values. It embodies honor, vigilance, and self-sacrifice, but not in isolation. And that's what made James's action so powerful. It didn't reject tradition, it fulfilled it. Because at the heart of British ceremonial life, whether in palaces, on battlefields, or in whispered moments with strangers, is the belief that the role of protector is sacred. And what, after all, is a protector? Is it someone who never moves, or someone who knows exactly when to move? James Harrison knew. He knew that medals can shine, but they mean nothing if they don't reflect something deeper: empathy, integrity, service. And Emily carried her new medal everywhere. Her parents later shared in a handwritten note that she insisted on wearing it to her hospital appointments. When nurses asked where it came from, she said, "A soldier gave it to me. He said I'm one of them now." Think about that. One moment of recognition had shifted her self-image from patient to protector, from being watched over to being honored. And isn't that what we all long for? To be seen not for our weakness, but for our strength. To be defined not by what we've lost, but by what we still choose to give. That's the brilliance of what happened at the palace gates. In a place so steeped in centuries of order, it took one soldier and one little girl to remind us of something eternal, that the highest form of strength is not stillness, it's sacrifice. James gave up a moment of perfection, of ceremonial precision, to create something far more enduring: memory, legacy, connection. It's what separates a man in a uniform from a true guardian of the realm. And while the tourists that day came for pictures, they left with a parable. Because deep inside, they knew they had witnessed something rare, something that can't be ordered or rehearsed, something that lives not in muscle memory, but in moral memory.
Months passed, the seasons turned. Leaves fell from the London trees, and the tourists returned in droves to Buckingham Palace, taking pictures of the guards who stood, as always, motionless and proud. And yet, something lingered in the air for those who had been there on that morning. They spoke of it in quiet conversations. Tour guides paused by the gate and whispered the story to new groups. Children pointed and asked, "Is that where the girl got her medal?" And somewhere beyond the gates, James Harrison continued his post. Silent, unmoving, watching. But here's the twist no one saw coming. One rainy morning, James received a letter, not from the palace, not from a commanding officer. It was handwritten on soft pink paper. The handwriting was shaky but determined. It read, "Dear sir, thank you for making me feel brave. I wear my medal every day. The doctors say the medicine is working a little better. Mommy says maybe it's because I'm standing tall now, like you taught me. Love, Emily," one of the royal guards. James held that letter in his hand for a long time. He didn't smile, not outwardly. But inside, something stirred. A A soldier's heart, often trained to harden, had softened in the right places. You see, the true twist wasn't that he broke protocol. It was that by doing so, he redefined it. James didn't just bend a rule. He raised the bar for what duty could mean. Because in a world where appearances often trump actions, he chose substance. In a system built on symbols, he chose connection. And in a role designed for silence, he chose a voice gentle, unwavering, true. Let us not forget what he showed us that day. That medals are earned in more ways than one. That strength is not loud. That honor isn't stiff. That sometimes the highest act of service is to kneel. And this is why the royal guards are more than ceremonial figures. They are historians of humanity. Guardians not just of monarchy, but of meaning. They stand in the face of storms, distractions, mockery, because they know what they represent. But the best among them, they also know who they stand for. And sometimes, on an ordinary morning, that someone is a 7-year-old girl with a beanie and a dream. So now we turn to you. What would you have done in James Harrison's place? When is it right to break with tradition, and when is it wrong not to? Tell us in the comments below. And if this story touched your heart like it, share it with someone who believes in quiet courage. And subscribe, because tomorrow we'll bring you another true story from the Royal Guards that shows just how deep discipline can go. Until then, remember this: sometimes the greatest strength lies not in standing firm, but in knowing when to bow for the sake of something higher. See you in the next story.